All right. We are now recording. We are now streaming. We'll give everyone a moment to join. But yes, Derek, this one sucked. This one I've read through twice now, and I'm generally not sure if I fully grasp it. I have some parts of it, but I do not have the background in Freud that I think is, maybe not even Freud. Freud and Klein, I think, is the combo here that would have helped, we could say. And we've been doing the anti-Oedipus reading, and I'm finding it increasingly difficult to separate this writing out and not bring things in that I've read in his future works or other things, because this is previous handful have been pointing towards it. This is a different mentality around a lot of things. It matches stuff that's coming up in AO, but it's a different way of talking through it significantly. So it's been difficult for me. That's been my reasons. How about you?
Yeah, I think it was slowly beginning to kind of make sense. I think the other part of it, obviously, is the Oedipus cycle, the Oedipus myth itself as well. It's quite an important element within the stuff running through it.
Yeah.
And anyway.
Yeah, it's going to be a lot. We may not have too many join today. I started the announcement late. It happens. Plus, it's weird Monday. So I think I'm hesitant to say we do a full reading like we did last time, because I think it's not, well, is it as necessary? I'll open this up to everyone. Do we want to do a close reading, or do we want to just charge through the ideas and talk through the paragraphs and kind of cite stuff? Jack votes close reading. I've figured. Derek, Kent? Okay.
Yeah, I would like a close reading.
Why not? And Kent has left. It's fine. We don't need anyone except us. All right. Let me go ahead and mute my other shit on my desktop real quick. Get through all of it. All right. Close reading. I'll go ahead and start then. Kick us off. Hello, and thank you for joining us at this lovely Monday at the Deleuze and Guattari Quarantine Collective's ongoing reading of Logic of Sense. Today we move into the 29th series, Good Intentions Are Inevitably Punished. This is going to be a close reading today, we have decided, so be ready for that. You're in for quite a bit. I'm hoping we're going to be able to get through this in 2.5 hours, because this one's more complicated than the last two. I think. And maybe as we go through, we'll find it simpler. No major announcements today or anything. Please, if you support us, follow us on Twitter for no reason. I don't really use it. And also you can find us on Patreon if you want to toss a buck or two our way to keep the server running. That's lovely. It's DCon. I'll go ahead and dive in, and we'll read the first paragraph on the first page. I'm at the bottom of 202, and I'm going to go ahead and stream that text a little bit into the room just as I go. That should be good. It is necessary, therefore, to imagine Oedipus not only as innocent, but as full of zeal and good intentions, a second Hercules, who will experience a similarly painful experience. But why do good intentions seem to turn against him? It is first because of the fragility of the enterprise, the fragility characteristic of surfaces. One is never certain that the destructive drives, which continue to act under the sexual drives, are not directing the work of the latter. The phallus, as an image at the surface, risks constantly being recuperated by the penis of the depths or the penis of the heights. Thus, it risks being castrated as phallus, since the penis of the depths devours and castrates, penis of heights frustrates. There is therefore a double menace of castration through pre-Oedipal regression, castration devouring, castration deprivation. The line traced by the phallus risks being swallowed up inside the deep spaltung. Incest risks also returning to the state of eventration of the mother and the child, or to a cannibalistic mixture where the one who eats is also eaten. In short, the schizoid and even the depressive position, the anxiety of one, the culpability of the other, threaten endlessly the Oedipal complex. As Melanie Klein says, anxiety and culpability are not born of the incestuous affair. They would rather prevent its formation and compromise it constantly.
I just think it's useful reminding ourselves, because this is a kind of continuation from the previous series. At the end of that previous series, I'm just going to quote a couple of things, which I think will give us a bit of context for what's being said here. So the first, this is on my copy of page 205. It's the final paragraph halfway down. He says, Oedipus is a pacifying hero of the Herculean type. So I think that's the first thing. That's kind of brings us into that. And further on, he says, this is at the end, he says, it is in the Oedipal phallic phase that a sharp distinction of the two parents occurs. The mother takes on the aspect of an injured body to be mended, the father taking the aspect of a good object to be made to return. And above all, it is here that the child pursues on his own the body, the constitution of surface and integration of the zones, thanks to well-defined privilege of the genital zone. So I think that obviously this series, so the 29 series, which we're now reading, leads on from that. So the reference, it is necessary, therefore, to imagine Oedipus not only as innocent, leads directly from that. But it's full of zeal and good intentions. He's full of good intentions. He's at the surface. He's trying to kind of bring these things together, I think, really. And as we've said at the end of the previous section, it's a second Hercules who will experience a similarly painful experience. And at that point, you need to call to mind the legend of Hercules, who was I'm a bit hazy on this, but I think he was not abused, what's the right word, but his mother, or his father's wife, I should say, did things to him when he was a child. Is that right? Does anyone know about the Legend of Hercules? So he was confronted by a couple of things. I can't remember, like serpents, I think, in his crib and that kind of thing. He
was tormented. I mean, he spent his life tormented. That was the sort of deal, is he was tormented his entire life. Not to say you can go by the television show with Kevin Sorbo, but they did lean heavily into the torment of his mother, the torment of the gods, the torment of everyone, because he was effectively a god from on high who had battled in the depths and instead lived at the surface of man, to sort of bring it directly to what Deleuze is talking about. That was by his father's mother, not Hercules' mother. Doesn't matter. He was abused like all the time. Like everyone tormented him. The torment of Hercules is a thing.
Yeah. So what Deleuze is comparing Oedipus to Hercules. And they said a second Hercules who will experience a similarly painful experience. And then he talks about the surface. Why do good intentions seem to turn against him? Because the fragility of the enterprise, fragility characteristics of surfaces. So both Hercules and Oedipus are working at the surface. Because one is never certain the destructive drives which continue to act on the sexual drives. So again, this is from last week. So we had this notion of drives at the surface, and the underpinning sexual drives, which are being kind of isolated or being rejected. So he said we can never be certain that the destructive drives, which continue to act on the sexual drives, are not directing the work of the latter.
And the drives he's talking about here, The drives he's talking about here are interesting because he specifically assigns them the anxiety of one and culpability of the other. So on the one side, you kind of have anxiety is clear, but then like guilt, the culpability of the other, the depressive position, as I think he's referred to it before, that of the heights, or the devouring schizo of the depths, the anxiety, this idea that this surface image is always threatened by these things, and they always are able to sort of subsume it, take it in, destroy it, cause cracks, whatever. He's got a lot of different ways he's described it so far, but it's an interesting sort of phrasing in it, the way he talks of it. As with that line from Klein, anxiety and culpability are not born of the incestuous affair. They would rather prevent its formation and compromise it constantly. So it's not so much that how to phrase this and say it slightly differently, but we have the Oedipus at the surface. Anxiety and culpability are not born of that. We don't start with Oedipus and move outwards. Instead, the guilt and the anxiety would do anything it could to prevent Oedipus from forming in the first place. And once Oedipus does, their whole purpose is to torment and compromise it.
Yeah. So yeah, they're working to stop, I think, the Oedipal relationship developing, I think. So just following on from the beginning, so the phallus is the kind of image of the surface. And then we have the two images of the penis at the depth, the penis at the height, and working against that. And phallus is the thing that traces a line, and this is always the kind of constant within this kind of Stoic thinking of the line at the surface. Previously, what he says is that phallus doesn't penetrate, but it traces a line on the surface. So this is the kind of relationship, this kind of phallic relationship that's developing. The penis at the depth, penis at the height, the phallus at the surface. It says it risks being castrated as phallus. So this is since the penis at depth devours and castrates, the penis at the height frustrates. There's a double, and this is where we get the double menace of castration through pre-Oedipal regression. So it's castration devouring, castration deprivation. The line traces the phallus risk being swallowed up inside the deep spaltum, which I think means division or split. And incest risk also returns to the state of eventration of the mother and the child, or the cannibal mixture where the one who eats, i.e. the infant, is also eaten, I would imagine, perhaps by the mother. In short, the schizoid and even depressive position, anxiety, compulsion, the other, threaten endlessly the Oedipus complex, so they threaten its formation, I would say. It rather than being anxiety and culpability coming out of the Oedipal incestuous affair, they're actually what they try to do is prevent it occurring.
Yeah, they are the action of the heights, like what the heights does, what the depths does is respectively, it's guilt and anxiety that are ultimately there to try to compromise the surface and pull apart the relationships it does. That's what we were talking about in the previous series. Oh my God, was it this last one or the one before, where we're talking about the formation of the surface and the way that I feel like this is playing into sort of how these elements are generated, the dynamic genesis, I think he phrases it at one point. Sorry, please go ahead. It's just the phallus and the way that it's utilized at the surface versus the penis. And his phrasing there is very particular because he talks about, again, in the previous, the pregenital erogenous zones and how we lay on top of that and create this sort of almost secondary dimension on top of these elements when they are the penis, which is just the body part. And those are the depths or the heights. And the phallus is this sort of secondary image and different thing, which is fascinating.
Exactly. He talks about a double castration, double menace of castration. So there's a pre-Oedipal regression. So this notion of anxiety and guilt, anxiety and guilt are not a result of the kind of of playing out of the Oedipus complex, but it's kind of pushing backwards beyond that, the time before that's I think the relationship that's been set up. And I think the thing always to bear in mind, I think, in this series is that it's the infant that's constantly being referred to within this.
Yeah, I like that point. I kind of think of the infant in contrast to the operator, especially because you mentioned the line traced by the phallus a lot. It sort of sounds like what Deleuze is walking out here is something about effects, right? There's something going on in relation to, so obviously what the child's finding traced, right? But the phallus seems to be actually part of the production of effects. And that seems to be, I mean, kind of to simplify it maybe, that tension you're noting between Oedipus and what's going on here, I think that's more or less what he's saying, right? There's this tension going on between the effects in their creation, and then this is the devouring of them. There's an easier word. The devouring them, or kind of the taunting of them from up high, right? And in between that tension, there seems to be the way the drives are forming all this, and like you're saying too, the way in which they're forming all this, but at the same time, there's the risk of the edible that's causing them not to be produced by the edible, but to produce in order to kind of curtail it.
Yeah, I think it's useful to think what is what's the aim of the Oedipal relationship. I think the narrative here is that the drives, what they do is they try and stop that Oedipal relationship forming, and through this notion of anxiety and guilt. I'm just referring back to the previous series. It's to do with the way, so the phallus is the phallus of the surface, which traces a line. And I think it's useful to refer back to the end of the previous series, where it says the phallus should not penetrate, but rather like a plowshare applied to the thin, fertile layer of the earth, it should trace a line at the surface. This line emanating from the genital zone is a line which ties together all the erogenous zones, ensuring their connection or interfacing, bringing all the partial surfaces together into one and the same surface in the body and the child. Moreover, it's supposed to re-establish a surface in the body of the mother herself and bring about the return of the withdrawn father. So this is the kind of action, I would say, of the kind of Oedipal relationship, in that it's kind of tying all the erogenous zones together, but it's also kind of creating a unity between the child, the mother, and the father. The return of the withdrawn father, I should say, which is in that kind of pre-Oedipal, in the pre-Oedipal stage, which I can't remember what it was called originally. It might have been the schizoid frame, but I'm not sure. But I think that's what's being imagined is happening at this Oedipal stage. But the sexual drives of the height and the depth are constantly trying to straight it through giving towards this creating this what is called the pre-Oedipal regression of castration devour and castration deprivation. The guilt, anxiety prevent the formation of the Oedipal complex.
When he outlines the first, so that what we're talking about, and they outline this in the table of contents, there's 3 steps to this dynamic genesis. The first step is two ago, which is the idea of how we go from noise to voice. Noise, which is bodies, to voice, not surface necessarily, but it kind of plays in that space. And how the good, specifically the good object, and how the good object plays in this. And the phrasing around that is essentially that the good object kind of gets to force from the partial objects, the Kleinian style partial objects, its form from the body without organs, which again move back to the depths. It's this bouncing back, this manic depressive position, the good object, the superego, these things. The second sort of step of this is when we start talking about the sexuality, which is at this point the generation of the surface. And this is the second step, which is the formation of surfaces and the coordination between them. Again, to go and again, how he's weaving all of this through, the communication of events is kind of what happens here, the coordination between these elements. And so on the one side, we have the superego, which makes partial surfaces possible by viewing them from on high, reacting to the depths spread out below them. I think it says 6,000 feet in a reference to the Zarathustra line. The superego then separates these drives out. The schizoid sort of sits there sort of underneath that. This third step is interesting because he's sort of bringing out and having a conversation around the surface and its production against the heights and the depths, and the way in this process that the surface isn't made and then we have anxiety and frustration and things. Instead, that we have those elements because that's their natural sort of antinomy, antagonism with the surface. Is that a fair way of sort of laying this out? Because this has been very difficult for me. I'm trying to find a way.
Yeah, I think the like I say, I think one of the core ideas is the Oedipus cycle, and in the end, Oedipus, it's a tragedy. It kind of fails, and the theme here is good intentions are inevitably punished. I think that's the kind of that's what haunts Oedipus. So he thinks he's got it all sorted out. Yeah, it comes back to kind of claim him basically that the what's it called, I forgot what to say, the myth of Oedipus, the thing that's set up that will happen. He thinks he's got everything sorted, but in the end it's fulfilled, and so the good intentions are inevitably punished. I think that title refers to the Oedipus cycle, the Oedipus story.
Well, and it describes out the fragility of that surface. Again, to go back to how the cracks form.
Yeah. I think, because the surface is the thing in which things are brought together and they're kind of reconciled. Underlying it are the drives which work to destroy it. Because as Deleuze says here, he's also said elsewhere, the reason is the surface is fragile. It's always in danger of being, and I think a term he used earlier was snapped up at other things. So this is the inherent kind of fragility of the surface where Oedipus is located, where in this first instance where the Oedipal complex is located. Running alongside that is the story of Oedipus himself.
I'll move to the next paragraph. JK, did you have a thing?
Yeah, so by associating, Hercules with Oedipus, right, as a kind of a hero of the, of the heights, in order to reach the surface. Klein is not denying the tragic element of Oedipus, right? He recognizes the Oedipus is the tragic hero. Is that my understanding? Because there's kind of seems to be two sides of how her interpretation is coming through. That somehow Oedipus is a Herculean hero, but at the same time once he reaches the surface, Oedipus is going to go through some shit, because he still has these longings for the depths, right? And that's how he meets his fate, his tragic fate, right?
I think from previous series, I think the the relationship between Oedipus and Hercules, I mean, as he says at the end of the previous series, Oedipus is a pacifying hero of the Herculean type. What that means is that, my understanding of that anyway, is that we had Hercules in a previous series in which Hercules basically descends into the depths, and he brings things to the surface. He pacifies things at the surface. So there might be a monster in the deep which he brings to the surface. Similarly, there might be something in the height which is brought to the surface and pacified. And I think the image of Hercules is earthbound. That's his essential image. And I think the idea is, so Oedipus is, as just again to quote Deleuze, is a pacifying hero, the Herculean type. So he's working to pacify at the surface. And what is he pacifying? Well, it's the kind of, it's the, not the drive so much, but it's the bringing the mother and the father together, and the erogenous zones kind of pacify together. That's the aim, I would say, of the Oedipal complex.
I would add, and again, there's probably someone out there as I say this who's listening who goes, fuck you, because I get Melanie Klein wrong. But from what I've read, one of the big things she did a lot to sort of flip a lot of Freud's theories sort of on their head in their own. But very specifically, Freud essentially posited that from the Oedipal complex, out of that comes the superego. That's where it's formed. She reversed that. To her, very specifically, the depressive stage, guilt within children, was seen far earlier. She was able to sort of do studies around this and have this conversation that kids, as much as I think 1-year-old, had fantasies around anxiety and guilt, and that these things existed pre-genital. They didn't involve the same stuff. And so for her, she was able to sort of show the opposite, that the superego was formed prior to Oedipus. And so I think that's what a lot of Deleuze is talking through here is, you know, going again away from this idea that the ego or that the Oedipus complex forms everything, but instead that our structures internally form these other elements or react to them or beat them up. His line here, they would rather prevent its formation and compromise it constantly, versus the idea that the Oedipus complex essentially spawns them, which is more traditional psychoanalytic theory.
Yeah, I think that is a really important distinction, right? Oedipus, or at least to go this line, in short, the schizoid and even the depressive position, the anxiety of one and the culpability of the other, threaten endlessly the Oedipus complex, right? So they're threatening the Oedipus complex, but with that, I also think it's a little reciprocal, right? It also means the Oedipus complex is affecting the schizoid and the depressive positions, right? As Melanie Klein says, anxiety and culpability are not born of the incestuous affair. They would rather prevent its formation and compromise it constantly, which is what you're saying, Brooks. That one of the main distinctions here that Klein is giving us is that Oedipus isn't, it's not like all this stuff is coming from Oedipus. Oedipus exists in a relationship here, and the schizoid and the depressive positions are forming anxiety and culpability basically to prevent the formation more or less of Oedipus, right? They're not just reacting to it. They're doing things in relation to this, both as threat, but also in kind of a way, keeping it possible in a weird way, right? Like I'm saying, there's kind of a reciprocality there.
Well, and just to read, I posted some text just to read a little bit from Klein, not from her, about her. It was not only children's play, but the developmental task of learning that could be obstructed, according to Klein. The development of the primal scene into the terrifying images of the early Oedipal complex could lead to severe distortion of intellectual development. These early fantasies had a remarkably different character from those of the later, mature Oedipus complex. In these early phases, the Oedipal objects were experienced in primitive form, archaically good or bad. That's going to be important. And engaged in an immense variety of forms of intercourse between themselves. So different was this conception of the Oedipal couple that Klein coined the term combined parent figure for it. In 1935, Melanie Klein described the depressive position, which arises from a major developmental step. At that point, good and bad versions of the object can be recognized for the first time to be the same figure in reality. Much of the distortion of the Oedipal couple at the early stage is connected with the combining of good and bad objects. The capacity to enter the depressive position marks the transition from the early Oedipus complex to the mature stage and results in an increasing respect for the reality of external objects. The emergence into the depressive position, feelings of protectiveness and repair gather as the determining characteristics of a mature Oedipus complex. There's a lot there, but I think it's speaking into very much what they were talking about here. Melanie Klein says, anxiety and culpability are not born of the incestuous affair. They would rather prevent its formation. They exist as kind of Jack was saying, a cyclical back and forth.
Maybe due to the anxiety that develops, pre-Oedipal, might be just the absence of the mother, right? Because the mother's not always there, and because that kind of absence could be a cause of that, infantile anxiety. And then the Oedipal complex comes in when the father enters the picture, and that's I mean the absence is experienced as a castration, perhaps. That's how I interpret that, maybe.
No, I like that. Think about it. I don't have the background in psychotherapy or any of this at this level. This is some much further stuff. But mine has been really interesting. I do want to get to the next paragraph, though, so I'm going to dive forward a little bit. This first response, however, will not suffice. The constitution of surfaces has also, as a principle, mention the separation of sexual drives from destructive drives from the depths, and in this respect, it encounters a certain complacency on the part of the superego, or of the good object of the heights. Thus, the dangers of the Oedipal affair must also derive from an internal evolution. Moreover, the risks of confusion or of corporeal mixture, evoked by the first response, take on their full meaning only in relation to these new dangers generated by the Oedipal enterprise itself. In short, this affair necessarily creates a new anxiety proper to it, a new culpability, or a new castration, which is not reduced to either of the preceding cases, and to which alone the name castration complex corresponds in relation to Oedipus. Constitution of surfaces, the most innocent, but innocent does not signify without perversity. We must realize that the superego abandons its original benevolence at the Oedipal moment, for example. When we go from the organization of pregenital partial surfaces to their genital integration or coordination under the sign of the phallus. But why is this so? Get to that answer in the paragraph, but discuss this paragraph and sort of dive in. Again, we're talking about this sort of fragility, again, from the first one. There's anxiety, danger, which comes from this sort of internal principle of surfaces. The superego actually, as he says, it does away with its benevolence, its original benevolence, and it goes from organization of pregenital partial surfaces to organization under the sign of the phallus. It makes things what they ought to be, maybe is the phrasing. It's a tough one. Anyone, please dive in.
So, he says that this first response, which I take is what's been set out in the first paragraph, is not sufficient. So then he goes on to say why. The constitution of surfaces as a principal intention. So the surface separates the sexual drives from the destructive drives of the depth. the encounters are complacently part of the superego, the good object, and the good object in this instance, I would say, is the father. Previously, it was the mother, but that now in this stage, I think it's the father. So the father is now seen as complacent. So he says the dangers of the Oedipal affair was derived from internal evolution. I'm not quite sure what that means, actually.
I think we got to be a little careful with the father and mother right now because he hasn't walked that in just yet, right? And I hate to say because it's so deeply Freudian, but the big thing he's focusing on here is the phallus and the penis, right? So much so that he's differentiating between the phallus as image and the penis of the depths or that of the heights, right? And so I think what he's going into here is before going into things like the father and mother, yeah, the big thing, there you go. I think he's trying to get into a kind of cracking that's occurring, right? I think Derek was talking about this in the last paragraph, but there's something about splitting that seems to be happening in relation to castration. And so when he writes this bit about the superego, thus the dangers of the Oedipal affair must also derive from internal evolution. So something's happening in the depths, right? But I think too he's going to go into the bodies themselves, right? So things are happening at the surface with the bodies, but he goes on. Moreover, the risks of confusion or of corporeal mixture invoked by the first response take on their full meaning only in relation to these new dangers generated by the Oedipal enterprise itself. In short, this affair necessarily creates a new anxiety proper to it, new culpability, or new castration which is not reduced to either of the preceding cases, and to which alone the name castration complex corresponds in relation to Oedipus. So there's something going on in this paragraph where that first response is not sufficing, and I think that's kind of the Klein line he ends with. But what Deleuze seems to be pushing toward is basically a new idea of how castration, anxiety, and depression are forming. And part of the reason he's doing that is he's going to tie it back into what's happening with the bodily or the causal and what's happening with this point about the effects.
So I slightly different read on this. For me, when he's talking about internal evolution, he is talking about the bodies, but specifically around the dynamic genesis that happens at the surface. The phrasing he's got in the sentence you just read, new dangers generated by the Oedipal enterprise itself. The way that bodies and their meanings shift is at the surface. We have the Oedipal enterprise itself generating new dangers, which gives the bodies their full meaning. So there's this internal evolution. He's being very, to me, as I'm reading that, he's talking about internal to specifically the series or surface that is generated around our Hercules, around Oedipus, around all of that, the meanings that are generated and the sense that's generated, all of that. The dangers come from its own work, because we have the corporeal solutions that ultimately are there. We also have the shit at the heights, but the dangers get generated by the Oedipal enterprise itself. The line after, this affair necessarily creates a new anxiety, which is proper to it, a new culpability or a new castration, which is not reduced to either of the preceding cases, to which alone the name castration corresponds in relation to Oedipus. That the surface generated this meanings in response. That there's the external pressures pushing, it has its internal evolution, and out goes the other bits. And this is that Oedipal enterprise. Not to use too much of a word, but I would say apparatus or machine of Oedipus.
Yeah, I think the just one point. I think the good object at the end of the previous series, the good object is named as the father. I think this is a continuation of that. I think what's happening here is that in the previous paragraph, the the anxiety and guilt was formed from the depth of the castration devouring, castration deprivation of the height and the depth. But now it's happening within the relationship between the infant and its parents. So it's an internal evolution. I think it's internal to that. Now thinking about it, I think it's internal to this relationship. And because of the complacency of the part of the superego of the good object, and like I said, the good object is named at the end of the previous series as the father. And this creates a new, what Deleuze calls a new anxiety. So previously the anxiety was coming from the destructive drives underneath the surface and then up the heights as well. Now it's happening, as you say, Brooks, at the surface. So this affair creates a new anxiety, which is proper to it, a new culpability or a new castration, which is not reduced to either of the preceding cases, which is, as we said, which are castration deprivation, castration devouring. And this is the castration complex. So he names this now as the castration complex, and to which alone the name castration complex corresponds in relation to Oedipus. So the constitutional surface is most innocent. Innocent does not signify without perversity.
Just
So
real
the
quick,
surface-
because that sentence, just
Yeah.
real quick, Derek, sorry, that sentence I really am attaching to, because it's the whole thing. This affair creates a new anxiety, which is proper to it, a new culpability or new castration, which is not reduced to either of the preceding cases, and to which alone the name castration complex corresponds in relation to Oedipus. We're now talking again about the communication of events. Because we're talking about things at the surface that correspond in relation to each other and continue to produce. Things are being made at the surface. This is what Hercules does, is this, and the pressures from both sides. Sorry to continue. Please continue, Derek.
Yeah.
Really, that phrasing is really great to me.
Yeah. So the constitutive surface is most innocent, but innocent does not signify without perversity. So the perversity is this generation of the castration complex in the complacency of the good object, i.e. the father. So we must realize that the superego, which is the father, again, I would say, I mean, I might be misreading this, but let's just imagine that this might be correct. We must realize that the superego abandons the original benevolence. The father returns as being, the aim of Oedipus is to bring these together, or the Oedipal relations, to bring the mother and father together. He says the superego abandons original benevolence at the Oedipal moment, for example, when we go from organization preacher. So then he's then looking at the way it actually functions on the body of the child. The question at the end, then it leads to a final question, which then is developed in the next paragraph. But why does this happen? Why is this so?
Which I'm going to just dive to because I don't think we can spend more time without going forward. Yeah. The surface has a decisive importance. Secondly, the surface has a decisive importance in the development of the ego, as Freud clearly demonstrated when he said that the perception consciousness system is localized on the membrane formed at the surface of the protoplasmic vesicle. The ego, as factor of the primary narcissism, is initially lodged in the depths in the vesicle itself or the body without organs, but it is able to attain independence only in the autoeroticism of partial surfaces and all the small egos which haunt them. The real test of the ego then lies in the problem of coordination, and thus of its own coordination, when the libido as superficial energy invests it in a secondary narcissism, and as we earlier suggested, this phallic coordination of surfaces, of the ego itself on the surface, is accompanied by operations which are qualified as Oedipal. This is what we must analyze. The child receives the phallus as an image the good ideal penis projects over the genital zone of his body. He receives this gift, narcissistic overinvestment of an organ, as the condition by which he would be able to bring about the integration of all his other zones. It is that he cannot accomplish the production of the surface without introducing elsewhere some very important changes. In the first place, he splits the gift-making idol or good object of the parents. Both parents were combined earlier in accordance with formulas clearly analyzed by Melanie Klein. The maternal body of the depths comprised a multiplicity of penises as partial internal objects. Especially, the good object of the heights was, as a complete organ, both penis and breast. Mother provided penis, father provided with a breast. We believe now that the cleavage is achieved as follows. From the two disjunctions subsumed under the good object, unharmed, wounded, present absent, the child begins by extracting the negative and makes use of it in order to qualify a mother image and a father image. On one hand, the child identifies the mother with the wounded body, being the primary dimension of the complete good object. The wounded body must not be confused, shattered or fragmented body of the depths. And on the other hand, the child identifies the father with the last dimension, that is, with the good object retired to its height. As for the wounded body of the mother, the child wishes to repair it with his restorative phallus and make it unharmed. He wishes to recreate a surface to this body at the same time that he creates a surface for his own body. As for the withdrawn object, he wishes to bring about its return, to render it present, his evocative phallus. Not said there. Said there. One real quick thing, the reference here to Melanie Klein and spending all of her time. For her, she didn't necessarily believe in the idea that man and mother, father are seen as two separate entities. There's a cleavage that happens that start with the original good object, which is sort of parent, like just as a thing, the people who deal with it, seeing, father with a breast, mother with a penis, all of these things. They didn't really split them out. We should be assuming that children are able to really split these things out. Yeah. So, where do we start? One of the things here, the ego itself is the first agent of primary narcissism within the depths. It sits on the body without organs, as he says. And then it coordinates and invests partial surfaces with libidinal secondary narcissism. This is the play, the superficial energy, and invests it in this secondary narcissism. This movement over time, this production then of the rest of these elements, is an interesting sort of order of things. Jack says it's weird to read this after reading AO. Sounds like he's saying Oedipus opens the door to the perverse. I'm not quite there yet, but it's really hard to read this and try to pull my brain away from the things that are pushing me right at anti-Oedipus. This is very difficult, because a lot of this stuff, I see how I interpreted this. My first sort of reaction is that he's putting together those pieces of the generation of partial objects and meaning through the three syntheses and how we form mother, father, me, or how we become Oedipalized, but how the images of such things get formed from partial objects in the Kleinian view. And it's a really interesting way to do it. And the ego and superego and id as being part of that is really unique. And it's giving some really perspectivist sort of tingles in the back of my neck.
I think the this paragraph is split into two essentially. So the first short bit is when he lays out what he says, this is what we must analyze. So that he gives a description of how the ego, and I'm taking the ego to mean the infant, the infant's ego, the sense of itself is formed. It brings in this notion of the body, and it's a kind of physical kind of thing as well as being psychological. It's kind of formed at the surface. The body without organs seems to be, from this description, a literal thing. Then the second part, following on from that, when he lays out what needs to be analysed, is, I would say, it goes back to that definition he gives of Oedipus as a pacifying hero. I think this is a process of pacification in which the mother, the infant parent relationship is formed and made pacific, made what's the word? Unthreatening or whatever, I'm not sure.
And it's, but I mean, so okay, so if we're talking towards the end of this, and maybe I'm massively misreading this, he is making an argument here that also that the Oedipal complex isn't necessarily about wanting to fuck the mom and kill the dad, that it's about actually restoring the mother, replacing the father in that relationship, fixing what has now become a broken object, the wounded mother, the wounded image. And this, well, this is a perverse view. This is not it's not a sexual thing in that way. It's not that type of perversity, but it's definitely perverse in the sense that it's sort of flipping things on its head. But it's this idea of like the best intentions, again, good intentions of the Oedipal complex, which is to fix mom and dad, fix my parents, anxiety or guilt, the tragic hero. And it feels like he's saying Oedipus here is like a tragic hero.
Yeah. I think he's a pacifying hero. I mean, he's making things right. But the thing was, in the previous paragraph, talks about the presence of perversity within this. So I think at this stage, I think it's quite descriptive, I would say, this section. So he lays out the description, a kind of Freudian description of how the ego is formed, and then he says then it's analysed in the remaining section of that paragraph.
To comment too on that, because I noticed too, Brett, it doesn't seem like the typical Oedipus image, right? Like you're saying, it's things are going on in terms of like restoration and that, right? This line really stood out to me. It's just about where you were reading. Deleuze writes, here we go. We believe now that the cleavage is achieved as follows from the two disjunctions subsumed under the good object: unharmed, wounded, present, absent. The child begins by extracting the negative and making use of it in order to qualify a mother image and a father image. The bit that really stood out to me there is this point about extracting the negative. It almost sounds like this is a problem of affirmation, and that seems to be more or less an interplay for the Oedipus complex with this new qualification of the castration complex for Deleuze, right? There's something going on here with the two disjunctions and the child reacting to a negative use here, right? Which is very interesting, because usually when I think of Deleuze, he doesn't go as into the negative. But here there's something going on for the child where extracting that negative is going to lead into the creation of the images of the father and mother that are going to go into the Oedipus complex, like you're saying. This point about, like, if nothing else, a restoration, right? Trying to, like we were saying, trying to set things right. And that's the interesting thing with the image. It almost sounds like the image is produced because of a negation, which is very weird to have that following two disjunctions here.
It does feel like two disjunctions, and like it's, or maybe it's, no, it just feels like that.
But yeah, it's two disjunctions. The trick is they're subsumed under the good object, right, which connotes the superego. Something there seems to create the negative that the child's going to use to create the, well, that the child uses to create these images.
Yeah. This is the process is going on under the the aegis of the primary narcissism and the secondary narcissism. So it's really a psychological process that's taking place within the child, or within the infant, and he's trying to integrate all these factors within himself. Um, but it's he's not. I think he's not aware maybe of the Oedipus forces of that's going to determine um, the that's going to determine him into this towards this tragic destiny. But it's a kind of a naive idealism taking place within the psychology of the child, right? So that's how I interpret this what he means by primary and secondary narcissism.
Yeah, I guess, looking at this, rereading this second bit of this paragraph, I think there's an important element there when so previously I was thinking previously said at the end of the previous series that the good object is the father, but he in this he says actually the good object. So what the infant does, so he splits, so it's kind of about halfway down. What the infant does, he splits the gift-making idol or good object of the heights. This good object, the height, are both parents combined. So both parents were combined early according with formless, analysed by Melanie Klein. And he says the maternal bodies of depths comprise a multiplicity of penises, of partial internal objects, and especially the good object, the heights, was as a complete organ, both penis and breast. Mother provided with the penis, father provided with the breast. So now the cleavage, these are split, is achieved as follows. From the two disjunctions, subsumed in the good object, unharmed, wounded, present, absent, the child begins by extracting the negative. And what the negative is there is the negative of each of those disjunctions. So wounded and absent. That is extracted from each of these disjunctions. And then and the child makes use of it in order to qualify a mother image and a father image. So they're both made negative. On one hand, the child identifies mother with the wounded body, in the primary dimension of the complete good object. On the other hand, the child identifies father with the last dimension, is the good object retires to its height, i.e. absent. This is a kind of laying out of the process that through which this happens. So the mother is made, is wounded, and the father is absent through that process of the child. And then he goes on to say the wounded body of the mother, the child wishes to repair it with his restorative powers, make it unharmed. So this is a kind of, again, this kind of notion of making things good. He wishes to create a surface to this body at the same time that he creates a surface for his own body. For the withdrawn object, i.e. the father, he wishes to bring about its return to render it present with his evocative phallus. So child has both, he splits both these things off, but then they're both, he wants to bring them both back together again. It's a kind of process of splitting and then bringing, not combining, but bringing back and making good through his activity.
Yeah, I like your point about the process, because if we walk this back into the whole like events thing, right? One of the suggestions in this paragraph to me, and even in what you're saying, is that it sort of sounds like what's going on with this event, especially as we're getting into the perverse. I'm hesitant to say it's restoration in that, but there is something going on in terms of the process where the event is being produced in such a way that, like we're saying, there's this good object and the image of the phallus, obviously, right? That is affecting the child, perhaps the operator, or perhaps bodies in general. And that with that affection, we have the constitution of that line, right? It sounds like we're talking about effects now. But with that, like you're saying too, there's this point about I'm just calling it the cleavage here, but this kind of castration going on, which is to recreate the surface to his body at the same time that he creates a surface for his body, for his own body, right? Like you're saying, there's something going on with these two identifications and this sounds like the imaginary to me, but there's something going on with those identifications that relates to the way the event is being produced, but in such a way that also provides a splitting, or perhaps a kind of cracking that is going on to, and here we go, you've got the point about the eternal return. As for the withdrawn object, he wishes to bring about its return, to render it present with his evocative phallus, right? So there's something about the use of the phallus here, which is to bring the object on high, basically down.
The
I
phallus.
think he wants to make everything good. He wants to. Again, it's good intentions. These are the good intentions of the child.
Right.
To
The whole
comment
point
real
of the
briefly,
phallus.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
It's okay. Well, the whole point of the phallus is doesn't the phallus represent a desire to restore and to restore and to bring back something that's lacking, that's disappeared. So it is a symbol of desire, right?
I don't say it's a symbol. I think what he says, it's the phallus is it's a surface. Perhaps it's an image. I'm not sure, because he talks about the penis at the height and of the depth, whereas the phallus is at the surface.
Right.
It's a thing that's tracing the line. This is what he says. It traces the line. So it's the phallus. Any reference to phallus, I think, within this series, refers to is a reverse to the surface.
Right. So you have to interpret it as a symbol of as representing desire and maybe power, right? The power to do something, or whatever that good intention might be. It is a power to a desire, right?
I'm not sure if I would use. I'm not sure if the word desire. I don't know. It might be. But again, it's this going. If you refer to the end of the previous series, he describes Oedipus as a pacifying hero, the Herculean type. What that means that to be of the Herculean type means to bring things to the surface all the time, and to make them specific, peaceful, joined together. And I think this is what I think is happening here. So it's bringing the mother, mending the wounded mother, repairing the wounded mother, and making the withdrawn object, the absent father, present.
Sure, right. So it is a kind of you can interpret Oedipus as a hero in that Herculean way, but that doesn't prevent him from making the error, the tragic error that Oedipus does make, right? Eventually.
That's why I keep leaning on him being a tragic hero, because and I think it's, again, not necessarily that Oedipus makes a thing, or we shouldn't be ascribing sort of one doing another, because there is, and the way they phrase it, the way he phrases it, internal evolution, the changes over time based on the movement down to the depths and back up, and how the superego treats it and back and forth. I think there's something to be said for the production of the tragedy as part of this entire nation.
And this is, I think, part of the strangeness of the series, though, too, especially with the phallus's image at the surface, risking constantly being recuperated by the penis at the depths or the penis at the heights, right? It almost sounds like what we're doing is we're talking about like a more or less a bodily penis, or a mixture that is something of that nature, right? That provides not exactly a castration, because we're going to qualify this new third one, but qualifies this problem of the heights and the depths affecting the phallus's image at the surface, right? So it almost sounds like we're trying to access the, again, to me, it almost sounds like the imaginary, right? It's very strange, but with that, the question that's really striking me here, especially in terms of the paragraph we just read then, so is then what's going on with this new point about the castration complex, right? Is this a problem of the negative through the way that the superego is being affected here, and then turning around and affecting the child so as to produce the splitting, right? It would almost sound like the splitting is through an affectation of the negative here, right? And this is going to lead into, like we were saying, this problem of restoration, which sounds like, I don't know if it's lack per se, but it definitely gets into a problem of, trying to address the disjunction in its subsumption, right? There's a nice rhyme for you. Trying to address the way that the disjunctions have been affected by the object on high, and in a sense trying to deal with what appears to be negation. And to me, that's the strangest bit of all this, is where that seems to be where these paragraphs have taken us.
And I think the next paragraph will develop it further, and I think bring out some of the paradoxes inherent in that.
And I just want to add, because it's going to be important as we go. I think another thing is when he phrases and says that the surface, or Hercules or Oedipus, is innocent, the phrasing there, it feels to me as though we're talking about intent. We're talking about the depths are devouring their anxiety-filled nightmares. Heights are this frustration, world of guilt from the depressive position, but surface is innocent. The surface doesn't have directed intentions. It's sort of being the thing that it is. And that's how I'm reading when they say innocent. And then
I think I was going to say, yeah, I think the surface is where things are mended. I'm just looking back to I think the previous series at the end says this. Its role is to mend the wounds that the destructive drive by external objects have inflicted. Sorry, Brooks.
No. I think I'm going to jump to the next paragraph because I think it's worthwhile. I think you guys are right. Just wanted to kind of have that in there because it's going to come up. The tragic innocence, the hero, all of that is about to come. So let's dive through. In the unconscious, everyone is the offspring of divorced parents, dreaming of restoring the mother and bringing about the return of the father, pulling him back from his retreat. It seems to us that this is the basis of what Freud called the familial romance and its linkage with the Oedipus complex. Never has the child, in his narcissistic confidence, had better intentions. Never again will he feel as good. Far from casting himself into an agonizing and guilt-ridden venture, never in this position had he believed himself so close to dispelling the anxiety and culpability of the previous positions. It is true that he assumes the father's place and takes the mother as the object of his incestuous desire, but the incest relationship, almost by proxy, does not imply here violence, neither aventration nor usurpation, but rather a surface relation, a process of restoration and evocation in which the phallus brings about a lining of the surface. We darken and harden the Oedipus complex if we neglect the horror of the preceding stages where the worst has already happened. And we forget that the Oedipal situation is attained only to the extent that the libidinal drives are liberated from the destructive drive. When Freud remarks that the normal person is not only more immoral than he is, but more moral than he suspects, this remark is true above all with respect to the Oedipus complex. Oedipus is a tragedy, but we must be able to imagine the tragic hero as gay and innocent, and as starting off on the right foot. Incest with the mother through restoration and the replacement of the father through evocation are not only good intentions, for it is with the Oedipus complex that the intention, the moral notion, our excellence, is born. As intentions, they are inseparable extensions of what is apparently the most innocent activity, which, from the point of view of the child, consists of creating a total surface from all his partial surfaces, making use of the phallus projected by the good penis from above, and causing the parental images to benefit from this projection. Oedipus is Herculean because, as peacemaker, he too wishes to form a kingdom of surfaces and of the earth to fit his size. He believed that he had warded off the monsters of the depth and allied himself with the powers on high, and in his endeavor, the restoration of the mother and the summoning of the father are the targets. This is true of the Oedipus complex. Okay. There's actually a lot said here, but I thought it was fairly crisp.
Yeah, no, I agree.
There's so many lines in here. I actually just wish we could spend hours sort of deconstructing. There's that one sentence with all of the Asians. That was terrifying to read. But the specific line, we darken and harden the Oedipus complex if we neglect the horror of the preceding stages where the worst has already happened. We forget the Oedipal situation is attained only to the extent the libidinal drives are liberated from the destructive. Right now, we're in the third part of the dynamic genesis. This is the third part, is this element of Oedipus, or what Oedipus is. The steps, as I sort of said before we got going, this is about starts with language. The first stage of the dynamic genesis begins when language and univocity is fashioned out of the schizoid system. The good object of the depressive position, which begins to extract this voice from on high, from the sonorous depths. This is the first stage. Second step of the genesis is the formation of surfaces and the coordination between them. The superego generates partial surfaces possible by viewing from on high, reacting to the depths, and it separates the libidinal drives from the destructive drives. The schizoid position resists the depressive position by piercing the body with orifices or closing itself off in the body without organs, all of that stuff. But the second step is essentially the layering of surfaces and the communication of events. This third step, where we're talking about here, is the sort of inaction of it, enacting, en, not in. The Oedipal complex here, as it's being played out in this paragraph, is saying that if we don't remember how we got to this point, these various bits that have come, we harden it, we darken it, we forget the horror without understanding that these elements have happened. The libidinal drives have been liberated from the destructive, which he's gone into a few times as being fairly important. And because of this strangeness, there is for lack of better words, there's a purity of intentions. I don't think he's saying it here sarcastically, good intentions, like, oh, it's good intentions. I think he's genuinely meaning it like innocent good intentions, that this element that's there, there is no negative hope, there is no damage hoping to be done, that there is like a purity to this moment for the child. And that in this moment, with this first intention, this moral notion par excellence, this first thing becomes a thing that now exists and is born. And the third part of the dynamic genesis.
Yeah, I think that's good. Oedipus is driven by good intentions, by morality, and the Oedipus. So right at the end of that, he said the restoration of the mother and summoning of the father is the true Oedipus complex. So, yeah, that's a kind of, I would say, the kind of summation of the good intentions.
Yep.
What they're aimed at. The next part of this title of this series, I imagine, I can't remember, is to come, inevitably punished.
Yes. or how it turns out so badly, which I think is the beginning of the next paragraph.
I could comment too as we look to moving to that. So from a perspective of ethics, then this paragraph and obviously this section will become extremely important, right? Because if you're going to do ethics, and you're going to think about like normative theories of ethics, right? Intentionality is a huge topic that's discussed, right? In a Kantian sense, it can be extremely important, right? What you're trying to do and what your duties are help produce in terms of intention, that makes up a brunt of ethical theory. If you're going to do existentialism and things like Sartre, not only is what consciousness intends toward in terms of objects going to be extremely important, but the way you're going to be able to develop good or bad notions of morality is going to be tied to intentionality, right? The interesting thing here then would be if you read Deleuze in relation to that idea of intentionality, he seems to be then suggesting that intentionality and good and bad intentions, right? They're being created, right? What produces them? They're being produced at a level of image restoration, right? Which is a very interesting argument, but also says a lot about so if you're going to take those notions of intentionality, then where are they finding the good? They're finding the good in trying to deal with a negation, right? One that's subsumed by the superego.
And I think a big part of this is also just to go back to Hercules, because he mentions that a few times here and earlier. Hercules was, we want to talk, I mean, it's a complex series of myths. I'm going to miss a lot. But there was absolutely all I'm trying to do is like, why can't we get along mentality to Hercules. It wasn't that he was trying to be the most powerful. He wasn't trying to like usurp. He just really wanted everyone to kind of live at peace. That was his thing. And the tragedy within him is that. So there's that line, he believed he had warded off the monsters of the depths and allied himself with the powers on high. It's the Trials of Hercules. In his endeavor, the restoration of the mother and the summoning of the father are the targets. This is the true Oedipus Complex. It's straight out of Greek mythology. The best intentions. Sure. We'll move forward to the next paragraph.
Well, before you do, I'd be remiss if I didn't comment on just one more sentence. Oedipus is a tragedy, but we must be able to imagine the tragic hero is gay and innocent and is starting off on the right foot. Part of the reason I mentioned the intentionality bit earlier, this almost sounds like, to me, this is like a common, with an eye toward Camus, right? There's that very famous line, we have to imagine Sisyphus happy. And this almost seems to look out the corner of the eye at that. I won't say any more on that, but I just thought the reference was interesting. The thing I'd really be remiss to leave unturned is that I have to draw attention to starting off on the right foot bit, because that's just too funny. Oedipus having his club foot, right? So with intentionality, we start off on the good foot, just like one with the club foot. Gotta love that joke.
So is there like two interpretations of Oedipus, that he's a tragic hero, due to some flaw in his character, and the other interpretation is that he's a tragic hero because he can't change his fate, he can't change his destiny. He's determined. He has no choice. And the other one, bringing up the moon means that he did have a choice, right? He did have a choice in spite of his in spite of himself. He does have a choice.
I think he has intention. He had good intentions. Good intentions are not rewarded, as the title of it says. Intentions are inevitably punished. I think your question, is developed. The answer to it is developed in the next paragraph.
Agreed. I think I'm going to go ahead and move us through it. But why does it all turn out so badly? Why is the product of this affair a new anguish and a new culpability? Why does Hercules find in Juno a stepmother filled with hatred, resisting every offer of reparation, and in Zeus a father ever more withdrawn, turning away from his son after having favored him? One could say that the affair of the surfaces, good intention, the kingdom of the earth, encounters not only an expected enemy from the infernal depths, whose defeat was the question at hand, but an unexpected enemy as well, that of the heights, which, however, rendered the affair possible and can no longer bail it out. Superego, as the good object, begins to condemn the libidinal drives themselves. In fact, in his desire for incest restoration, Oedipus saw what he saw once the cleavage has been made, but what he saw once the cleavage has been made, but should not have seen, is that the wounded body of the mother is not only wounded by the internal penises it contains, insofar as its surface is lacking a penis, it is wounded like a castrated body. The phallus as a projected image, which bestowed a new force on the child's penis, designates, on the contrary, a lack. This discovery threatens the child in an essential manner, for it signifies, on the other side of the cleavage, that the penis is the property of the father. Wishing to summon the father back and to make him present, the child betrays this paternal essence of withdrawal. This essence could not be found, but only as if recovered in absence and in forgetfulness, but never given in a simple presence of the thing would eliminate forgetting. It becomes therefore true, this moment, that by wishing to restore the mother, the child has in fact castrated and eventurated her, that by wishing to bring back the father, the child has betrayed and killed him, transformed him into a cadaver. Castration, death by castration, becomes the child's destiny, reflected by the mother in this anguish he now experiences, and inflicted by the father in this culpability he now submits to as a sign of this. He's really running that Hercules allegory kind of to its limits right there. But it's spot on. Hercules is, Zeus sort of did claim him at some point as the champion. It was all proud, and then effectively was an asshole, drunk, absent father the rest of it. And Hercules spent many years trying to, daddy, look at me, mentality. So there's if we want to talk about Hercules and how it relates, Zeus stooped down, the superego, stepped down from the heights, had an affair, and created this thing at the surface, this Hercules, and then kind of just stopped caring. Superego as our absent father, kind of feels like there's a Fight Club line, but a really good.
That's the strange thing too, right? I mean, a big part of Hercules is one way to read that those stories. I really shouldn't try to make them monolithic. There's so much going on there in terms of literature. But one thing we could talk about in relation to that body of works is the theme of redemption, right? Especially with the 12 labors. The interesting thing about Oedipus then is it's less redemption, it's restoration, right? And that's kind of the parallel I'm seeing is, and it's just I would have to do more work to qualify that within logical sense, but that does seem to be part of what's affecting, especially the intentionality here, right? Hercules has to perform certain labors if he wants that kingdom and that, right? It's a weird kind of redemption because he's a demigod and all that, so it's very strange in certain respects. But with Oedipus, it's very different. He's dealing with humanity on its own terms with the gods on high, as opposed to being in a partiality with them. And I guess Deleuze's point is that that's an interesting way of dealing with the Oedipal story, right? It's a story about restoration, which gets into the whole idea of the partial objects, right? It's a very interesting technique he's using.
Yeah, I think what he said in this paragraph. So with Oedipus or and Hercules are at the surface, and so he characterized the surfaces as the intention and the kingdom of the earth. So these two things characterize the surface. At the surface, what is encountered is not only the expected enemy from the depths. That's where one would expect the enemy of the surface to come from. But there's unexpected enemy of the heights, which obviously in the case of Hercules is his father. Also in the case of Oedipus and the Oedipus complex is the infant's father. So the superego, as the good object, begins to condemn the libidinal drive themselves. In fact, in his desire for incest restoration, Oedipus saw what he saw. So this is he's describing this section, the why it turns out so badly. So the cleavage, once a cleavage has been made in terms of the wounded mother and the absent father being restored, but should not have seen. So he said what he saw, but should not have seen. So Oedipus sees something he shouldn't have seen. The wounded body of the mother is not only wounded by the internal penis it contains, insofar as its surface is lacking a penis, it is wounded like it's wounded as a castrated, as a lack of a penis. This is what Oedipus sees. The wounded mother is castrated in that sense. So the phallus, as a projected image, should bestowed a new force in the child's penis, designating the contrary a lacking. So the mother is designated as a lack. And then from that, what happens there, the penis is there, and it signifies that the penis is the property of the father. So it's this is what Oedipus is seeing, which he shouldn't have seen. And wishing to summon the father back to make him present, the child betrays the paternal essence of withdrawal. So he seems to be saying that the essential nature of the father is to be absent, the paternal essence of withdrawal. This essence could be found only if recovered in absence and in forgetfulness. So then it goes on at the end. It becomes therefore true at this moment that by wishing to restore the mother, the wounded mother, the child has in fact castrated and venerated her. So she's become castrated through this, realized the lack of penis. And by wishing to bring back the father, the child has betrayed and killed him and transformed him into a cadaver. These are two things that the castration and death become the child's destiny. The castration reflected by the mother in the anguish she experiences and inflicted by the father in this culpability now to submit. So he gets these things of anguish and culpability are returned now. They now return. Thing that she thought had been banished now return. And so why does it all turn out so badly? You can't escape these this what he calls at the beginning of the paragraph a new anguish and a new culpability.
Yeah, you're spot on there. And this is the third form of castration I was talking about, where castration from the depths and castration from the heights no longer cut it, right? Like you're saying, this third form comes about, and that seems to be more or less the Oedipal form.
Well, I think it's the the process and the construction of this and the utilization of the superego in creation of the images enforces sort of this, with the best intentions we have out the other side. I'm not trying to jump too much ahead, but it's this projected surface, this bullshit layer that's put on top of things that the superego sort of creates, that in itself has this forward movement and intentionality, but due to that movement also has this other side to itself. This really awful thing that it does, specifically in the lines of the Oedipus Complex. It switches from, the mother, father, inclination, essentially one object, the cleavage that happens. But it's not that I see my mother as a whole person or even with internal phalluses, but instead this awful transition to, they actually no, father stole it from her, broken and wounded, and at the same time my father is distant and will never return to this. It just creates it in that sort of idealization, creates its own sort of break problem.
Yeah, and that does make sense with the idea of perversion, right? I mean, to be perverse is like to will to do, in a sense, is to will to do something outside of the accepted, right? For our purposes here, obviously that's tied to the not the inception, tied to the oh man, I didn't get enough sleep last night. Tied to the intentional. There we go.
Yes. Well, that's the last line is, castration, death by castration becomes the child's destiny. Again, having a discussion earlier about destiny and fate and how they play. Reflected by the mother, in this anguish he now experiences, inflicted by the father in culpability he now submits to as a sign of vengeance. Very specific things in phrasing here. The anguish that he experiences, the anguish, anxiety from the mother, is from the depths, and inflicted by the father, the guilt. Like again, to go back to that phrasing earlier, it's that guilt and anxiety aren't produced by Oedipus. They would rather destroy it and constantly torment it from both sides. And here's how that is produced, sort of, again, in that cyclical way, as you were referring to it earlier, Jack. I do want to get to the next paragraph, though, really quick. Any last thoughts here before I move on?
Yeah, just to play off your point very briefly, that's the interesting thing about the Oedipal complex and that too, right? It ends up actually basically reconfiguring, or if you like, constituting the anxious and the culpable in a whole new manner here, right? A kind of reversal takes place.
Yes. Well, I would also say, and to Pretzel's point also, Pretzel says, we see the compelling psychosexual narrative, but we must consider that women's desire may not have been the penis, may not have been masculinity, sexual. That is where Lacan makes some headway, yes. I would say we're also seeing very early bits of really deconstructing, as he says earlier, in the unconscious, how these partial objects come to be. That originally to a child, there is no mother-father, but instead the parent-parental unit, and that they are one, and that there's a cleavage that happens. That cleavage is produced. As such, I think it would, like, he may not break it down. I don't think he does, but the way that a younger female or a younger male would react to this may be different, may be similar, but still we're talking about in the unconscious how the partial objects, the Kleinian partial objects play out, is very different from the Freudian, which puts, the onus essentially on the male child's and almost entirely. Didn't have some very enlightened views. But I think Deleuze is doing a lot to address that here too. Actually, that's this next phrase. It's about penis again. All this story began with the phallus as an image projected over the genital zone, which gave to the child's penis the force of embarking on this venture. This is the last two series. Again, we're talking about the dynamic genesis. But everything seems to terminate with the image which is dissipated and which carries along with the disappearance of the child's penis. Perversity is the traversal of surfaces, and here, in this traversal, something new and changed is revealed. The line that the phallus traced at the surface across every partial surface is now the trace of castration, where the phallus is itself dissipated, the penis along with it. This castration, which alone merits the name complex, is distinguished in principle from the two other castrations, that of depth through devouring absorption, and that of height through privation frustration. It is a castration through adsorption, surface phenomenon, like, for example, the surface poisons, the tunic and the skin which burn Hercules, or the poisons on images might only have been contemplated, such as the venomous coatings on a mirror, a painting which so inspired the Elizabethan theater. But that happens, it is in virtue of its specificity that this castration recovers the other two. As a surface phenomenon, it marks the failure or illness, the premature mold, the way in which the surface prematurely rots, and the surface line rejoins the jeep spaltung, or incest rejoins the cannibalistic mixture of the depths. All of this in conformity with the first reason which evoked. Whew. That one I'm going to need help on.
So I think he's saying that those first two forms of castration, that of the depths and the height, they're going to make possible this third form, right? And that's going to be not only made possible by through them, but it's also going to be used in them in such a way that perversity, and this is kind of the play on intentionality, right? The perversity here, in a sense of trying to more or less negotiate those two, or kind of, shall we say, diffuse them, as the Oedipal complex, right? The diffusal of those two, if you like, actually produces through more or less through intentionality here. And I've already made my belay point to that with the point about the negation, I think. That belay point actually produces a new form of castration, which is going to be the Oedipal. And I guess to conclude that, and in doing so, it doesn't really negate the other two, right? It actually combines them in a sense, which is how he's getting his play on adsorption.
Okay.
I think he's distinguishing. I don't think those are two. Right, the way I read this, so perversity is what traverses the surface. So he's, as you said earlier, he said the innocent. So the surface is innocent, but innocent does not signify without perversity. The perversity is a traversal of surfaces. So going back to, so now from this, from the previous paragraphs, he now says the phallus trace at the surface across every part is now the trace of castration. Previously, it was the kind of it was a kind of one of pacification, bringing things together. I would say, mended the wounded mother and the returning the absent father. So it's now the trace of castration. Both are castrated. The mother devoid of a penis, and the father dies, becomes a cadaver through castration. So this castration, which now merits the name complex. So the Oedipus complex is the castration. It's distinguished from the other two castrations, that of depth and of height. It's a castration through absorption, and he gives this kind of this example of this through absorption, which is a surface phenomenon. So the inertial absorption is a surface absorption, and he gives examples. So as somebody's already spoken about, those are the tunic and the skin which burn Hercules. So puts on this tunic, and there's poison within the tunic, and it burns Hercules. The poisons on images which might have only been contemplated. So poisons on images which are looked at and then somehow poison the person looking at them. The venomous coatings on a mirror or on a painting, which so inspired Elizabethan theatre. But as it happens, it is of its specificity that the castration recovers the other two. So as a surface, but anyway, it marks the failure or illness, the premature mold, the way in which the surface prematurely rots, and surface line joins the deep spaltum. It kind of surface now then rejoins the kind of other two. I don't think what the word is, but anyway, the other two joins or incest rejoins the cannibalistic mixture of the depths.
So my question would, sorry, go ahead, JK.
I was going to say so castration is a kind of a cutting off, a detachment, a kind of a destructive force, poisonous force that by that very process of destruction, you create something new, you unify and become more integrated with something else. Right? So Oedipus, is performing an act of castration when he kills his father, but by doing that, he also unifies, becomes unified with his mother, right?
But both are castrated, aren't they? Both the mother and the father are castrated. He says it's a castration through absorption, so it's a surface phenomenon. So I think it has to be a surface phenomenon.
Yeah, but it is a process of a kind of a destructive process that leads to a reunification or integration, but it's a process that continues. Right?
Yeah, because he says the surface rejoins the deep spaltum.
Right.
Which is the kind of split between
right.
I would say. I mean, I would think between the depth and the height.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Right.
Or incest rejoins the he goes on. Incest rejoins the cannibalistic mixture of the depth.
Right.
All
It's
of this
like
in conformity with the first reason, which we invoked earlier, which takes us back to the beginning of this series.
This is one of the interesting things, before I turn over to Brooks for his question. What's being produced here then is a disjunction of castration, right? Which is very interesting following this point about the subsumed disjunction. Because as I'm reading it, right, what do intentionalities do, right? So they actually lead to this, a new form of castration which produces a disjunction of the other two. At the same time, during the process of that disjunction's formation, you have the surface line, right? And the way that that's being tracing across. This third form of castration, interestingly enough, right? The other two forms would seem to be trying to stop that tracing. But what the third form that seems to do is actually, with that tracing, actually sort of deploy the other two forms so as to more or less affect the heights and affect the depths. So you almost have a kind of inversion going on here, where what's trying to be prevented through intentionality actually perversely affects that which is trying to prevent it. And it does that by the very means that would seem to be trying to prevent it, namely the other two forms of castration.
The other two forms of castration are one diving into the depths, which detaches, or heading to the heights, which detaches. They're not the complex or the Oedipal complex, which I think at this point we are talking about not a critique of it as we would in Anti-Oedipus, but instead that the complex is what you might call the middle ground, the healthy surface in comparison to, say, diving into the depths, or like a well-adjusted person, whatever you might call. Because the way I'm reading this is we're talking about the image of the phallus, the perfected image that rises from on heights, the superego creates, by nature of its movement, wants to be whole, wants to be completed. As it goes through that process and tries to complete, it suffers excessive castration because it's not possible. And as this happens, these surface images that are produced through either the guilt from on high, which affect and, as he says, poison or burn surfaces, the images, or from beneath, which is the deep anxiety. These elements as a thing essentially are the drive and are themselves tainted or poisoned as they sort of mark forward. And so as we have the surface phenomenon of the Oedipus complex that has these idealized images of mommy, dad, me, the surface phenomenon marks the failure or illness, the premature mold, the way in which the surface prematurely rots. And all of this line that now is created by the phallus as an image across all of these partial surfaces becomes the line of castration, the dissipation of the phallus itself.
It's dissolved almost, and it returns to the depth, I would say, or it's reunited that which it thought the depth and the height, which it looked to escape from, I would say.
It looked to draw a peace between, because we have the superego on high, which, as he said, it separates out the libidinal and destructive desires. We have those two major sort of drives. But in the depths, they're just one big murky mixture mess. And so this sort of good-intentioned movement of Hercules ultimately causes him to be remarried with both sets of that. The cannibalistic mixture of the deaths, that phrasing is very specific about the destructive and sexual natures mixed together. That's the cannibalistic nature of the death. I think it's worth moving to the next paragraph, though, because it continues a little bit, because it doesn't end here. Continuing on. All right. Does anyone have any last thoughts before I do move on? Sorry, I'm trying to keep us moving forward because I do want to finish this sometime this week. All right. The matter, however, does not end here. The release, in the case of Oedipus, of intention as an ethical category is a considerable positive importance. At first sight, only the negative is present in the case of the good intention that is by. The willed action has been denied almost and suppressed by what is really done, and what is really done is negated as well by the one who did it and who rejects responsibility for it. It's not me, I didn't want that. Or, I have killed unwittingly. It would be a mistake, however, to think of good intentions and its essential perversity in the framework of a simple opposition between two determined actions, an intended action and an accomplished action. Indeed, on the one hand, the willed action is an image of action, a projected action. We do not speak of a psychological project of the will, but of that which renders it possible. That is, of a mechanism of projection tied to the physical surfaces. It is in this sense that Oedipus can be understood in the tragedy of semblance, appearance. Far from being an agency of the depths, intention is the phenomenon of the entire surface, or the phenomenon which adequately corresponds to the coordination of the physical surfaces. The very notion of image, having designated the superficial object of a partial zone, and then the phallus projected on the genital zone, and the pellicular parental images born of the cleavage, comes finally to designate action in general. The latter concerns the surface, not at all a particular act, but any action which spreads itself out at the surface and is able to stay there, to restore, to evoke, to restore the surface, and to summon the surface. But, on the other hand, I'm actually going to stop there. We're going to stop there. I'm going to continue. It's later. This is a fucking page paragraph again. Where to start?
I think he says that the previous paragraph, it kind of sets out the negativity of the Oedipus complex, how it's the good intention of Oedipus subverted by the unexpected enemy from on high, and which allows him to see that the kind of castration of the mother and the father. That he says is the Oedipus Complex, which is a kind of leads to this kind of reabsorption into the Spaltung. But I think this is now, he said, this is a kind of positive side, perhaps. The matter doesn't end here. Release in the case of Oedipus of intention. So the intention is so again, return to this idea of intention in terms of ethics is an ethical character. It's a considerable positive importance. So you say it doesn't, and there it's not purely negative. So there's a positive element to it. So yeah, you just go at first sight, the negative is present in the case of the good intention has gone awry. World action has been denied almost and suppressed by what he's really done. And what he's really done is negated as well by the one who did it and who rejects responsibility for it. So we have this, the willed action, what he has wanted to do has been denied by what actually is done.
Yes, the intended versus the accomplished.
And what really done it. Yeah, sorry, go.
Yeah, the intended versus the accomplished. It's as he says, on the one hand, the willed action is an image of action, a projected. Not speak of the psychological project of the will, but that is what renders it possible, the mechanism of projection services. This move, as we start talking about the tragedy of semblance, the tragedy of appearance, is kind of where these good intentions go awry, is this tragedy of appearance. Because ultimately, intention is the surface. Intention is not something of the depths. It's a thing produced, the phenomenon which adequately corresponds to the coordination of physical surfaces. We've been talking about the surface for some time now.
I think there is the intention to do something, but then there is the actuality, what is really done. And this is the essence of the Oedipus story, I would say, in that he doesn't know he's going to. He tries to escape the prediction that he will sleep with his mother and kill his father. He doesn't intend to do that, but that's what he does. He says that's why it's not me. I didn't want that. I've killed unwittingly. So the question is so one can have an intention, but the actuality can negate that intention. So what is the relationship between the two? It's a mistake to think of good intention and its essential perversity in the framework of a simple opposition between two determined actions. Intended action and an accomplished action. So what's intended and but what's actually accomplished.
And it's the three layers he runs through here very quick are the three elements of the dynamic genesis we've been going through. First, the very notion of image, after having first designated the superficial object of a partial zone, then the phallus projected on the genital zone, and the pellicular parental images born of a cleavage. These three steps comes finally to designate action in general. These three elements have designated action. They've essentially determined intention. Is what he's saying here, that there's a production effect here. The latter concerns the surface, not a particular action, but any action which spreads itself out at the surface and is able to stay there, to restore the surface, summon the surface. There's a thing that's created. And now I'm going to continue because I know everyone has questions, but I want to get through the whole paragraph before we really dive in. I want to keep going. I just wanted to take a break because there was a lot said. But on the other hand, the action effectively accomplished is no more a determined action, which would oppose the other, nor a passion, which would be the repercussion of the projected action. Rather, it is something that happens, or something which represents all that can happen. Better still, it is the necessary result of actions and passions, although of an entirely different nature, and itself neither action nor passion. Event, pure event, eventum tentum, to kill the father and castrate the mother, to be castrated and to die. But this amounts to saying that the accomplished action is projected on a surface no less than the other action. This surface, though, is entirely different. It is metaphysical or transcendental. One might say that the entire action is projected on a double screen. One screen constituted by the sexual and physical surface, the other by an already metaphysical or cerebral surface. In short, intention, as an Oedipal category, does not at all oppose a determined action to another, as, for example, a particular willed action to a particular accomplished action. On the contrary, it takes the totality of every possible action and divides it in two, projects it on two screens, as it determines each side according to the necessary exigencies on each screen. On one hand, the entire image of action is projected on a physical surface, where the action itself appears as willed and is found determined in the forms of restoration and evocation. On the other, the entire result of the action is projected on a metaphysical surface, where the action itself appears as produced and not willed, determined by the forms of murder and castration. The famous mechanism of denegation, "That's not what I wanted," with all its importance with respect to the formation of thought, must be interpreted as expressing the passage surface. I leave it open. That was a lot. I leave it open now. Woo!
So the interesting thing is I'm reading it. So to me, it almost sounds like he's starting out talking about a classic ethical problem, but certainly one that comes up a lot in Sartre, right? Which is more or less the problem of what you intended to do and what you actually did, right? Which in some senses gets constituted as like a question of how have you lived up to the condition of freedom, right? And this gets into the good and bad faith problem. But this is the interesting thing here. Deleuze is saying that's not really what's going on when it comes to the Oedipal castration, is it? Right? Because it would be a mistake to think of a good intention and its essential perversity in the framework of a simple opposition between two determined actions, an intended action and an accomplished action. The interesting thing here is when he gets into this point about the way that disjunction is used to create these two series, he seems to be saying that what's going on is Oedipus creates a whole structure, right? This is all the way back in like series 6, but it's either structure or semiotics, but the way that two series in their creation constitutes the structure, or maybe it was semiotics, but that seems to be what Oedipus is doing here, right? It's creating a whole structure that's going to be in a disjunction relating to two surfaces.
Yeah, I think this is really interesting because I think this image of Deleuze's of projecting images onto screens. So we have this relationship between the intention and the outcome, and actual outcome. Right. But it says the action effectively accomplishes no more a determined action which would oppose the other, nor a passion which would be the repercussion of projected action. Well, it's something that happens, or something that represents all that can happen. It's a necessary result of actions and passions of a entirely different nature, and itself neither action nor passion, pure event, eventum tantum. So it gets this amount to saying that accomplished action is projected on a surface, no less than the other action. So both are projected onto surfaces, but there are different types of surface. A surface, though, is entirely different. It is a metaphysical or transcendental. So we have this two surfaces. One is a physical surface, and one is what he describes as a metaphysical or transcendental surface. So the entire action is projected on a double screen. One screen constituted by the section physical surface, the other by an already metaphysical or cerebral surface. So intention as an equal category does not at all oppose a determined action to another. So as, for example, as he gives an example of a willed action to a particular accomplished action. It takes the totality of every possible action, divides it in two. So every action is divided in two and projected onto two screens. It determines each side according to the necessary exigencies of each screen. These things are kind of separate. They're there at the same time almost, but one is a physical, one is a metaphysical. On one hand, the entire image of action is projected on a physical surface, where the action itself appears as willed, is found determined in the form of restoration, evocation. So the entire image of action, this is Oedipus' action, is projected on a physical surface. The entire action itself appeared as willed. This is what Oedipus wants to do in the form of restoration. He wants to restore the wounded mother, evocation. He wants to bring back the absent father. On the other, the entire result of the action is projected on a metaphysical surface. The action itself appears as produced and not willed. One is a production, so they're kind of, let's call it, I don't know if it's a production of sense or something like that. Determined. So one is the will of the person, of the Oedipus. The other is determined by the forms of murder and castration. These two happen side by side. This is how it can happen.
And this is
So-
interesting too, because
Yep.
he's walking in a lot of language about appearance and phenomena here, right? So, right, where the action itself appears as willed and is found determined in the forms of restoration and evocation, right? On the other, the entire result of the action is projected onto the metaphysical surface, where the action itself appears as produced and not willed, determined by the forms of murder and castration.
Because earlier in that paragraph, he says that Oedipus can be understood as a tragedy of semblance, or which is a translation of appearance, or take from that appearance. So far from being an agency of the depth, intention is the phenomenon of the entire surface, or the phenomenon which adequately corresponds to the coordination of the physical surfaces. Yeah.
And semblance that's a very interesting use too, because the word alone suggests something that's stuff that's kind of put together and resembles or appears as something else, right? Usually it's sort of a makeshift connotation, but it seems it's very interesting here, right? Because we're seeing some of that phenomenological language come through.
I think the semblance is another word for simulacrum, a thing that appears as something it isn't. I think that's the way I would tend to read this, because the word simulacrum keeps coming up within this this present section that we're dealing with in this series, but previously. That's the way I would tend to read that. And he says the end of that paragraph, the famous mechanism of denegation, that's not what I wanted. What's important with respect to the formation of thought. It's been interpreted expressing the passage from one surface to the other. So the passage from the physical surface of the intention, the good intention, to the metaphysical surface of the bad outcome, determined by the forms of murder and castration.
Well, it's phrasing he's got really digging the shit out of is you have two sides where on the one side it's projected part of the intention where it appears willed, on the other where it feels like it appears as it isn't willed, and it's the way that they are two sides of the coin. I mean, that's very like the phrase. On the one hand, the entire image of action projected on the surface, the action itself appears as willed forms. On the other, the entire result of the action is projected on the action itself appears as produced and not willed, determined by the form. The mechanism of that talks about when you move from one to the other, where you go from, oh, that's what I want, to that's not what I wanted. You've crossed that very, very thin.
So one is the action, the other one is the result. I think the word result is important. It's the result of the action. It's what results from the action. And as it says, it's not what was intended. It is the result of the action. The formation of thought, and it's this notion of the origin of thought. There's something must be interpreted, expressed in the passage from one surface to the other, passage from the intention to the result of the intention.
Yeah, and this is the interplay, right? So the point about denegation, so you've got a movement between what could be willed, and whatever could be willed is going to be determined by restoration, evocation, right? And yet, on the other hand, you've got one series under those forms in terms of what seems to be willable, what could be willed, or what appears as willed. And on the other hand, you've got what appears as produced, right? What can be produced as opposed to willed under forms of murder and castration. So between the two series, then, you have a movement that's basically mediated by a "that's not what I wanted," right? And that's a very interesting ethical structure then, because the Oedipal ethics here would basically be one of good intentions through more or less a mediation of what you don't want.
Yeah. Right. Worth to move on now?
Yeah, let's go for it.
Right. Well, Derek, on the other hand, perhaps we are moving too fast. Sorry. It is obvious that the murder and the castration which result from the concerned that they do not by themselves constitute. They do not even believe it. But nonetheless, they are on the way, provided that we acknowledge that this is a long road marked. In fact, along with the narcissistic wound, that is, in the phallic line transformed into the trace of castration, libido, which invested the ego of secondary surface, undergoes a particularly important transformation, that which Freud called desexualization. Desexualized energy appeared to Freud as nourishing the death instinct and as conditioning. We must therefore grant a dual value to the themes of death and castration. We must grant the value that they have with respect to the preservation or liquidation, and in the organization of the definitive genital sexuality, on its own surface and in its relations to previous dimensions, schizoid and depressive position. But we must also grant the value which they take on as the origin of desexualized energy and the original manner by which this energy reinvests them on its new metaphysical surface of pure thought. This second process, which to a certain extent is independent of the others, proportional to the failure of the Oedipus, corresponds in its first aspect to what is called sublimation, and in its second aspect to what is called symbolization. We must therefore concede that metamorphoses do not end with the transformation of the phallic line into a trace of castration on the physical corporeal surface. We must also concede that the trace of castration marking an entirely different corporeal and metaphysical surface, which brings about transformation. This change raises all sorts of problems with respect to the energy which forms the new surface, to the very mechanisms of sublimation and symbolization, to the destiny of the ego on the stage. Finally, to the double belonging of murder and castration in the old. In this crack of thought, at the incorporeal surface, we recognize your line of the aeon, the death instinct, speculative. Within the Freudian idea, the death instinct, affair of speculation must, with good reason, be taken literally. At the same time, we must keep in mind that this last metamorphosis runs the same dangers as the other, perhaps in a more acute track, in a singular fashion, risks breaking up the surface, of which it is nevertheless inseparable. It runs the risk of encountering another surface, a simple trace of worse. It runs the risk of being swallowed up in the spaltung of the carrying with it all the debris of the surface, generalized debacle, and finally again, the point of departure, death and bottomless destructive dream. All this would follow from the previously noted between death. This is the central point of obscurity, raises endlessly thought to schizophrenia and to the psychotic spaltung in general, as well as to, or of course, all processes, including speculative. So we're having a conversation here about what happens with murder and castration. They sort of apply and play with libido, castration, play, sexual. I think the way to say it sexualized. Libido desexualized. In the phallic line specifically. The desexualized energy with Freud, which I'm not, if any, summary. Spend some time. But seems to be placing a great deal of emphasis on that sort of way to the complex now organizes the genital sexuality. Desexualized energy ultimately becomes manifested on the entire metaphysical surface that we've been. I'm going to spend some time Googling, please, if anyone.
Yeah, I guess so. It begins by saying perhaps we're moving too fast. So he's kind of talked about the metaphysical, the physical surface, and the metaphysical surface. I think here he's focusing more on the metaphysical surface because the metaphysical surface is that characterized by murder and castration. So, and he says it's obvious that the murder and the castration result from the action concerned bodies that they do not by themselves constitute. So they do not constitute for the metaphysical surface and do not even belong to it. So even though that they seem to be part of it, murder and castration is related very much to bodies. Therefore, it's kind of divorced from the metaphysical surface. He said, but nevertheless, they're on the way, provided that we acknowledge that this is a long road marked by stages. So he's that image of a road. So they are perhaps on the way to the kind of creation of this metaphysical surface. And then the narcissistic wound, that is when the phallic line is transformed into the trace of castration, which is what happens when good intentions go wrong, basically when good intentions are punished. The phallic line is transformed into a trace of castration, the libido, which invests the ego of secondary narcissism at the surface. So the libido undergoes what's called a particularly important transmutation, which Freud called desexualization. It's a kind of energy, desexualized energy. And this is where the death, so he's now, he said murder and castration are part of the metaphysical screen, or surface. But they're not, they don't constitute it. But now he's looking at a way in which the death instinct is kind of coming out of that. Through this desexualized energy, which is
that process is fascinating because, like, for Freud, the entire idea of kind of in these movies is about. I'm just going to read a little bit from what I googled, and I'm connecting with sublimation. Desexualization can be best sex. Whence the importance characterized by the sexual rising is together. The Freudian concept of sublimation help us understand the process of sexualization. It indicates the change of aim and object, which become social, sexual, shift from pleasure principle to reality principle. Sublimation of sexual impulse associated with their plasticity. Desexualization is, in a way, the pre-socialism. Another psychic process, ideally, which I think accounts for the object brought to perfection. That follows, I think, we must grant value, take the original manner, them on the surface, pure thought, the way that it's planned. Second process corresponds to the first aspect, second aspect. It moves from the first gift of, oh, I didn't want, did, ultimately having that self. Realization, I think, feels like that's it. Sorry, I'm not super.
So he says, so this notion of desexualization and the secondary narcissism. So he says desexualized energy appeared to Freud as nourishing the death instinct and conditioned the mechanism of thought. He says we must grant a dual value to the themes of death and castration. So these are the sort of two things that constitute the previously murder and castration. Now it's death and castration. They constitute the kind of metaphysical surface. This is they must grant a dual value to these themes. So the first one must grant the value they have with respect to the preservation or liquidation of the Oedipus Complex and the organization of definitive genital sexuality upon its surface, on its own surface, and in its relation to the previous dimension. So I think I would take the word liquidation as a strange one, but I would say I would take it to mean a kind of, as you previously used this kind of idea of liquidation as a thing that binds things together. So they're in a kind of it's like a liquid medium that binds. That's where I would read it anyway. Otherwise, it doesn't really make sense. So we must grant the value they have with respect to the preservation or liquidation of the Oedipus Complex and in the organization of definitive genital sexuality upon its own surface and its relation to previous dimensions. That's the first value. The second value, we must all grant the value which they take on as the origin of desexualized energy. In the original manner of its energy, reinvest them on its new metaphysical surface. So the desexualized energy, it reinvests them on its new metaphysical surface or surface of pure thought. So in a way, it's giving a kind of structure by which this metaphysical surface is formed through. Because it says at the beginning, it says the problem with thinking about the metaphysical surface being constituted by death and murder and castration is that they're concerned with bodies, so they don't really have that relationship to the metaphysical kind of thought. The idea of he describes it here of surface of pure thought. It now is given through this kind of notion of desexualization, through the death drive. He's given this. He's now attached them to this metaphysical surface. So he said this second process, which is to a certain extent is independent of the other, since it is not directly proportional to success of the liquidation of Oedipus, corresponds in its first So it corresponds to sublimation. Second aspect to what is called symbolization. It says from that we must therefore concede the result. Comes to the conclusion we must therefore concede that the metamorphoses do not end with a transformation of the finite line, a trace of castration on the physical corporeal surface. And this is where he now brings this idea of the crack. So he goes this idea of the crack is developed at real depth within the rest of this paragraph. The line becomes a crack.
It definitely seems to. Yeah, I'm totally with you on that. So.
It's the
the origin. One of the lines, real quick, that the we must grant the value which they take on is the origin of desexualized energy, the original manner by which this energy reinvests them on its new metaphysical surface or surface of pure thought. The playing with the representation of these things, or the way that things sit at the surface, these images that are created on this twofold setup, by being the sort of origin of this desexualized energy, they are the place of repression, because desexualized energy is repressed energy, right?
What he says is that the desexualized energy appeared to Freud as nourishing the death instinct. They're also conditioning the mechanism of thought. So in a sense, it's the opposite of repression. It's a condition for the mechanism of thought to take place. He says at the end of the previous paragraph as well.
Right, but you have this: the superego sees the two types of energy, death drive and death and sexual, destructive and sexual, whatever. Separates them out. Sexualized energy comes to the surface, and then gets the origin of desexualized energy is at this point when these elements, these images, basically again desexualize them, remove the sexual drives through what he's talking about here, which is repression. Like a desexualization is through and it's not bad repression as far as Freud's concerned, but it's definitely an act of repressive tendencies that desexualizes it and allows them to be reinvested as desexualized energy.
I don't know. I'm not sure about that, because I think he keeps saying about things like, for example, they preserve. There's an element of preservation within that.
Well, the sublimation comes afterwards, because it's the origin, and then we have the first aspect, which is sublimation, which is the shift in goal. It starts out sexualized. As it's sublimated, it's desexualized, and then symbolized as it's aimed towards the new ideal. The ideal object, the symbol of the things.
The symbolization is this creation of it's by as you said, energy reinvest in a new metaphysical surface, a surface of pure thought. And I think that's the kind of process of symbolization.
I'd have to dive into this, because I'm like fairly certain that a lot of Freud is about properly learning to desexualize energy and proper repression through that.
Yeah, but I don't know if Deleuze is, though.
No, it's just the phrasing of it is awkward because it kind of points to that. I'm trying to figure that out.
I think the key is that final bit of the paragraph when he talks about the crack, because this is what he's leading to. So the trace of castration corresponds to a crack, marking entirely different incorporeal and metaphysical surface, brings about transmutation. This change raises all sorts of problems with respect to desexualized energy, which forms a new surface. The very mechanisms of sublimation, and symbolization, the death of the ego on this new plane, finds the double belonging of murder and castration, the old and new system. So I think he sums all that up. All that, not sums it up, but he kind of places them all together, and then he will develop it further following that.
Okay. Well, so
And he brings in the idea of time. In this crack of thought, the incorporeal surface work out the pure line of the eon and the death instinct in its speculative form. He said the Freudian idea that death instinct is an affair of speculation. I'm not sure what that means, but must, with good reason, be taken literally.
He's saying that the whole process of desexualization is associated with the death instinct.
it seems like he's saying that the energy that's resultant, the desexualized energy, is associated with the death instinct and castration. So it's speculative death instinct.
But he says, keep in mind, he calls this the last metamorphosis. Runs the same danger as the others, and perhaps in a more acute manner, the crack in a singular fashion. So it's at the surface, risk breaking up the surface, from which is nevertheless inseparable. So something that happens at the surface, but it has this risk of breaking up the surface. It runs the risk of encountering again on the other surface the simple trace of castration. Even worse, it runs the risk of being swallowed up in the speltung of depth and height. It's an endless kind of formation and then deformation and being kind of swallowed up back into the depth. Kind of with all the debris of the surface is generalized debacle, where the end finds again the point of departure and the death instinct, the bottomless destructive drive. So again, it's this he starts off by talking about the way in which below the surface, there's always these destructive drives are always active. So the drive of libido might be on the surface, but it's endlessly in danger of being snapped up. That's a Deleuze's phrase that somewhat used elsewhere, by the what's underneath the surface. And again, this is an example, a further example. It keeps happening in each iteration.
And the phrase, the Freudian idea of the death instinct is an affair of speculation, must be taken literally. And he ends with the line, for of course all of life is a process of demolition, including speculative life. There's an implication there that the desexualized energy that's then powering this, and that is now the power of speculation effectively, that is pushing, is naturally destructive. But it seems like he's not necessarily saying it's a negative. He seems to be doing an affirmative play for it.
Yeah, I think this side. So he's split this in two. So we have the screen of physical and the metaphysical screen, and he's developed in this paragraph. I think he's looked at the metaphysical, but the importance of the metaphysical is that it gives rise to thoughts. It's so he says at the end of the previous paragraph. It's all its importance with respect to the formation of thought. So this is what gives rise to thinking. This is what the reference to speculative life is about. But it said sorry, I've lost my train of thought. But yeah, but I think that's basically what he's saying. But it runs a risk of being swallowed up back into the divided ego, the depth and the heights. All this would follow from the confusion we previously had between the two figures of death. Problem related to NMR.
And the two figures of death are the heights and the depths.
Yeah, that is a Spaltung. Great word. It says all life is a process of demolition, including speculative life. Therefore, all thought is engaged in this process of demolition. So the surface structure is forever being in danger of being snapped up. I can't think of a better way of saying it. By the depth, it's this process. This is a process of demolition. So he says previously it runs risk of being swallowed up in the spelting of depth and height, carry along with all the debris of the surface in a generalized debacle, where the end finds again the point of departure. Death instinct, the bottomless destructive drives. So it's this kind of endless balance between the subterranean destructive drives with the surface drives, or whatever they may be, with the libidinal drives, the metaphysical, the death drive. and the castration, etc. So they're always in danger of being absorbed back into the depth. I wonder if one could then call that, what was the phrase you used? I can't remember. Sublimation. I can't, not sublimation. What was that?
Sublimation.
Oh, you were
Sublimation and
saying
symbolization.
it's a negation, or what was it? Repression. So repression.
Yeah.
Were you saying repression? I can't remember.
I did say repression. Desexualization is, in theory, the proper repression of sexualized energy, which turns it into useful energy. I'm putting that in air quotes that you can't see.
I'm wondering if this just a speculative. I'm just speculating really that this image, this structure that he gives here, in which the surface is forever in danger of being dragged back into the depth, is a process of repression in that sense. Then I don't know. I'm just. But he says that it's what thought is always in danger of being subject to this process of demolition.
Well, I wonder if it's so much that it's actually in danger of part of the process directly, or raising it like constantly experiencing that. Again, the danger is that of anxiety from the depths. The depths will tear it apart and put into the heights, which is the aggressive phase, which it plays with guilt effectively, which can tear it apart in its own way. These forces constantly being there, feels like we have those two figures of depth, and at this point we now have this thing we've created at the surface, this dual image, this metaphysical surface that gets to live there and be there, and is naturally sort of playing into this space. I think Pretzel's spot on. I mean, we're going to be getting into the phantasm concept, and it's an awesome concept, and it plays very heavily. I'm trying not to jump to that, but I think we're talking about kind of the two pushes of the elements towards this surface that produces this new metaphysical surface as the two sides. Feels like it's completely driven by will, other that had nothing. Not what I wanted. But this crack of thought that produces this and has. All right, that's 2.5 hours. I am going to start slowly moving us to a stop. Any last thoughts? If anyone wants to keep going, I've got a real world, but I'm open. So if anyone has any last thoughts, any last notes on this, last questions.
Just want to say it's been a great day for the DGQC.
Every day, Jack, every day, every day.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, everyone. It's good. Enjoyed that.
No, that was great. I think I'll want to have, actually, I'll probably post a note. I want to have another discussion on this, but not necessarily going through it in points by points, and just kind of talking through a few of the bigger ideas before we get to Phantasm. Phantasm itself is an incredibly complicated thing to sort of rock for me, and believe we're on the verge of doing so, and I'm really excited for that. But I want to spend some time on some of the finer points, so I'm probably going to annoy someone later this week, be watching for a random pop-up Logic Ascents group. I think it's worthwhile before we get to, unless anyone disagrees.